Hi, I'm iKia, and for today's video I want to give an in-depth guide to parts of the loot system, and specifically loot sources and loot pools, as it is a system that is pretty poorly explained and also still poorly understood, as while we have some of the numbers, we do not have all of the numbers, and parts of it are still completely unknown areas, as numbers, for instance, for drops and how they trigger and how the system perfectly fits together is actually quite unknown to us. Now, we can go into parts of it though, and those parts can be quite handy to know, and that's why I made this guide. Now, this guide also then coincides with a written guide that I've made, as that was basically what I needed to get my thoughts all put together and get it to a point where I could explain it in under 2 hours, as I hope this video won't be that long. And this guide will of course be linked, and alongside of it will be the Reddit spreadsheet, which will be used in parts, as otherwise will be linked and talked about in parts here, as otherwise I would just verbatim be copying parts of that, and instead of that I'll just send you their way. And also to a Reddit post which explains targeted systems or targeted loot system quite in depth, and gives some numbers, as that is one of the parts where we do have numbers data mined. Now, this video comes with the caveat that it is mostly my terminology, what I use, and alongside of course, a ton of other people's. But there isn't a set lexicon for all of these terms. And the sources system, as I basically am going to explain it here, doesn't actually exist mechanically within the game. It's all pools. If you want to really look in depth into it. But I find in trying to explain it that splitting it up into what I'm going to talk about here in sources and pools, the sources part is quite handy to have alongside of it, just so it makes it a lot clearer, as otherwise there's a lot of points where there's a dozen or so pools, and if you want to discuss them it becomes hard, and instead of I pool them together into a source. Now, that's important for you to know, and yeah, just a caveat of all this, but there aren't many guides here, so we're going a little bit deep into the forest, so I basically am using the tools that I've developed so far, and hopefully it'll be fine. Now, jumping into the written guide as it is here, what we have here is, if I'm going to condense sources down, and that's what sources are for basically, so we can easily discuss drops, is that we split it into three, which is normal source, and normal source is just the normal single drops that you sometimes get, and that are untargeted as well. They're completely random within a set of pools of. They are still separated in LZ and DZ pools, of course. Now, targeted is then what the targeted loot system provides us for a targeted source, and those are the targeted drops. And then we have the specific source, and that is drops that can happen. There's basically a list on the red one. When we reach that part of the guide, I will show it. And these are alongside the other two systems, so the normal drops and the targeted drops happen, and alongside those a specific drop can happen, and those are tied to mostly final names of mission, bosses as we call them usually. And yeah, it is a separate system, and as such it gets its own it gets to be its own source. Now, here's some examples of sources, and this just to visualize and make clear what we're talking about what I'm talking about when we talk about these kinds of things. So here we have just a normal single drop, nothing special about it, and that's also nothing specific and nothing targeted about it as well. And that is just one normal source up. And this is, of course, the entire pool that is available at that point for it. Well, in this case, it's in the LZ, and depending on if you're in the LZ or the DZ, so LZ light zone, which is basically our wording for everything that isn't the dark zone, and then the dark zone is everything that is the dark zone plus PvP plus conflict caches, actually. Now, that pool is, of course, enormous. It's literally all the items that we have in the game. And that makes it quite hard to farm for specific things. And that's also why they added in the targeted loot system. The targeted loot system wasn't actually in the game at launch. It got added in it was either before Warlords or after Warlords. I don't exactly remember. But we've had it for quite a while. But there's also been quite a while when we didn't have it at the launch till we had it. But that made it quite hard to farm for specific things. And actually, it was pre-Warlords. It was way before Warlords, because we did used to farm items that were in Gear 1.0 with target loot. I just remembered, actually. Now, moving on, as that is a separate thing. Here we then have one normal and one targeted. And for targeted to drop, a normal has to drop as well. That's how the system is set up in the game. Targeteds can't drop by themselves. They always need to coincide with the normal. Now, in the case for named enemies, they both trigger together, and the targeted is basically guaranteed in that way. But when targeteds happen just alongside of a normal one, that is actually dependent on difficulty and directives. And the Reddit post by Google1234, who is a very prolific data miner for the game and has brought us many insights as quite a lot of things we have learned from him him and he has several people helping him as well. And all of the things he has brought forward so far have been corroborated by others, and he's a very trusted name in the community. So that post is also well worth reading, as it explains with numbers. For target loot, we do have actually percentages available to us and to discuss. And it explains how the targeted loot system basically works. And it's much easier to read that than to... And I also didn't want to add it into this guide, as it would make it exceptionally long, and I'm going to try to keep it under 3 hours, as I have a tendency to do. But here, we have a targeted loot dropping alongside of a normal. So this is just a normal drop happening from an enemy. We got a normal and a targeted triggered alongside it. Or what has happened here as well, that could be, is if this was from unnamed, then the targeted is basically guaranteed. And for that targeted to happen, a normal has to drop as well. Also of note, just quickly, is that when you have a chevron inside of the item, as you can clearly see there, and actually both items have it, is that that means that there is a top stat in that item. It doesn't mean that has multiple or good ones. It just means it has it there, and that can be quite handy, and especially for mods or something where it is a single stat, and you can directly know, okay, this mod might be worth checking. If we move on, so names will always drop a stack like we had above, which is one normal and one targeted. But there are actually special names, which we usually call bosses. They don't have a specific name to them by the game. We usually call them final names or bosses. And what those are the final names of missions, bounties, and summit boss floors, and probably some other things that I am not thinking of now. But what bosses always do is actually drop 2 normals and a targeted alongside of just miscellaneous stuff. Like, for instance, in this case, this was a hyena boss, and he has dropped hyena tactical assessments and some resources from that faction. Now, especially the tactical assessments is an important thing of why bosses need to be differentiated, as only bosses will drop tactical assessments. That's also why, for instance, control point names are never bosses. They're always just named. Both of them, none of them actually gets are tagged as bosses by the game, so to say. That's why they don't drop tactical assessments. Both of them will also just drop one named and one targeted, and never in this way two named or two normals and a targeted. Sorry, when I said named, I meant normals. Yeah, so that is the reason why going after some names is actually handy to know which ones are bosses. As, for instance, missions where you have multiple names, you want to have only the final one would drop tactical assessment. So if you're going after a mission and it has, for instance, 4 names like Lincoln, only the last one will drop it. And that's important to know, because if you were comparing it to, well, in the case of Lincoln, there isn't a shorter mission, but if there was a shorter mission that had one named, for instance, or actually bounties for to compare it with, where you have 3 names instead of the 4 from Lincoln, and they take about the same 5 minutes with travel time, then actually the bounties are better because they'll be a little bit shorter, and only the final name drops tactical assessments. And the final name isn't also actually the final name that you kill, but what is tagged by the game as the final name. So with the bounties, it's the final one on the list. With missions like Wall Street, it's drag off and stuff like that. Now, yeah, so if we move on, this is to show the game tags everything that matches the current targeted loot of that zone or mission as targeted loot. So what you quite often will see is if you have a single drop that is marked targeted loot, or if you have a double drop like here that is marked double targeted loot, that means that one of them is still actually from normal source. It just happened to match the target loot that is currently active. And this causes some confusion, because some people do believe that single targeted loots can drop, but that is never the case. It is a normal that has matched by chance the targeted loot. And important about the target loot is that, of course, there are much smaller pools, so they're much more worthwhile to farm to try to get something that you are after. You're much better off going after a targeted pool than going after a normal pool, as a normal pool is, of course, gigantic. And trying to get specific items out of it is very much discouraged. If we then move on, so this is actually the same happened with the boss. So it may seem here that we have gotten 2 targeted and a normal. And we have, if you're talking about the drops, but from sourcing wise, this is still 2 normals and 1 targeted. Just one of the normals happened to match targeted loot and gets marked as such by the game. So this marking of targeted, you can't really see it as being the definitive proof of the sourcing of the item, and that can sometimes cause for confusion. Also, alongside, another note is that when you have this large chevron as you have here at the top, as this image has, that means that there's a named item in the stack. If you were wondering what those was, as I do know that some people haven't figured it out, well, it's also a minor thing, so. Now, if we move on to specific drops, this is what happens when a specific drop happens alongside of a boss drop. So we still have those 2 normal sources. We have the targeted source, and then on top of that, we get one from a specific source. And that's why it's this other source than the other ones. And here as well, I make this a link to the Reddit spreadsheet. And actually, if I bring that up and we go there. So normally you would land here, as this is the only place that gets linked to. You can't link to a specific page on this, sadly. If you go into the exotic drop locations and chances, as this tab is here you have all of these unique source items, which is in the middle here. And these are all of the crafting item or crafting exotics, some of them that are tied to projects, and some exotics are also tied to specific things. So for instance, Coyote is linked to trying to find Coyote, and Oh, in a second I will control F if I will actually control F. Where's Coyote? There we go. So Coyote has a chance of dropping, of course, from the Coyote boss at the Jefferson Trade Center, and has these percentages tied to it. So 7% on heroic. And these are specific drops. And the specific drops are sometimes, of course, also required to get stuff into some pools. So for instance, for the Die City Holster, you have to do the entire project first before it goes into your exotic pool. And same, for instance, for the Nemesis, the Liberty, the Chatterbox, those are all crafting ones. And for instance, the current season ones, which are at the bottom here, will require you to have gotten them from the reward track first before they enter your exotic pool. And those are all specific sources for items, and these trigger on top of it when it is, for instance, Pestilence dropping in a DZ, it will trigger alongside of it. And these are just sources that you just have to know. You just have to go through this list, or when you're looking for something specific, especially the exotics from this list, then you can go through this list and see if there's a specific source for them. In general, the consensus currently is that it is almost always better to farm targeted loot to try to find your items that you're after, as you basically get a ton of small chances at the item from targeted loot instead of one of these bigger chances. But for instance, with that Coyote, that mission takes about 10 minutes to do on heroic and gives you 7% chance at the end of it. But the important thing to know, the specific ones, is when you can, there are times when there's also masks gets put on the Jefferson Trade Center mission, mask targeted loot, and then you can double dip. So you can try to go after it if you're after Coyote, and then you will both have chances with the targeted loot system, and then you also have chances on top of that with a specific source system. Same, for instance, for Sweet Dreams dropping off of Outcasts. If you're really after one, when there is shotguns on a mission of Outcasts, then, or a zone of Outcasts, mission it has to be, then you can double dip again as well. Now, moving on. So yes, and that's why we differentiate specific source. So specific source are specific items. You just have to basically know the list. After a while, you will kind of know the list, as some items are very specifically tied to either having gotten it somewhere else first, or they drop from specific factions and such. Now, the end of missions and end of activities rewards as well, these screens can provide you with targeted or items normally, or normal source items, and that's important to know to differentiate between some of them. So for instance, here we have a territory control which we've cleared, and there we get a targeted, and then we get resources and XP. And then here, for instance, this would maybe seem better because you get 2 items, but one of the items isn't targeted. So this is from propaganda broadcast, clearing that out. We get XP, a normal source item, and a targeted source item. But if you were to just look at these as just items, you go like, oh, I get 2 items, so propaganda controls are better to do than territory controls, disregarding time that it takes, because propaganda takes more time and a very much long discussion. But in the end, it's also even not true, because this is giving 1 normal source item and 1 targeted source. And what you really want when you're farming is targeted source. The targeted source, if you're doing it right and you are in the right zone or mission, then or you have set the right to a right one in Countdown or Summit, is a lot faster for farming. And that's why you very much want to know which sources are which, and go after targeted ones more than anything, over normal, over specific. Now, mission complete ones as well, we have, they can sometimes give you just a normal source item, and usually they can also give resources. So for missions, it isn't a guaranteed item. So usually with all of the activities, they guarantee at least 1 target on completion, just from that complete marker. And missions then also, what quite often happens is I am missing actually one image here, as you see here, as the game denied me it, and likely by the time that you actually get access to this guide, this will have been fixed. But yeah, the game just refused to drop exotic one for me to screenshot and import here, as yeah, sometimes when the game knows you want something, it will not give it to you. And the important thing with both names that you receive from invaded missions and the exotic, just the random exotic that you might sometimes get as a mission complete reward, both of those are also full random. So they're from normal source and they aren't targeted. And that sometimes confuses people. They go like, oh, I got a name at the mission complete, but it was AR targeted here, but I got a rifle. Yeah, that makes sense because it wasn't it was a normal source target. And this comes up, for instance, when the Anderson mission last season, where you could farm exotics from it every 12 minutes. You would just get an exotic at the mission complete point, which is no longer the case. They have fixed that. There, it was also a full random. It didn't pull from targeted. So actually, if you were after something specific, you were somewhat better off just farming it directly instead of going there. But of course, there you would also just get the item, and you could, even if you did, you would get an exotic item, and even if it wasn't the one you were after, you could then deconstruct it for its components, which always have value. But yes, so there it is important again to know which sourcing comes from that. And then for the summit specifically here, so the 3-floor finish, the 10-floor finish, which is the boss floor finish, and completing certain stages of challenges. It lists there's a list when you are in the summit where you can see at what challenge stages you receive targeted loot items. Those are all targeted loots as well. And what I don't have here and just realized now is that actually, yeah, so for instance, also the chests at the end of Summit, 3 floors, the one you open with a key, those will always have one targeted in them as well, alongside a selection of other items which are from normal source. So you only get one targeted there as well. Now, another sourcing, which is technically from specific source, is the Countdown Hunters. And the Countdown Hunters, the 4 final ones, so it used to be that all of the hunters drop 1, now only the 4 final ones drop 2 each to compensate for them having removed it from the initial 4, just so people don't go in and farm names off of them. And also, so actually the final rogue of a rogue encounter, a PvE rogue encounter, will also drop a named as well. All of those names are actually just from the normal LZ named pool. And that means that those names that you get from Countdown from those hunters are also not from a targeted source. So whatever you're targeted is set to doesn't affect them at all. And that decreases the potential for them to match what you're farming. And that can confuse and frustrate a lot of people, as a lot of people feel that, oh, I don't get the name, I get so many other names than the ones that I want. And that is true. And that is because the hunters at the end of, or when they're doing Countdown, the hunters at the end of Countdown, they're dropping from just the full pool of LZ names. So they're not dropping anything related to what you have set your target to. So if you're after a sacrifice, that pool that they're dropping from is a huge pool of just all of the names. It's not just the targeted pool from Providence. And one weird one that is a drop source, and that is that the 4 minor targets at the end of a manhunt, or that are parts of the manhunt. So actually, if I jump into game and bring up the current season ones, so these 4 minor ones that lead into the main target, whenever you kill these actually drop. They are guaranteed to drop unnamed, and that named is actually pulling from both the DZ and the LZ named pools. So it is equivalent to actually basically opening a named chest. And that's also where quite often people will get DZ and DZ/PvP items from, and they'll be confused. But yeah, it makes complete sense once you understand that they're a specific source that basically is the equivalent of having opened the named cache. And that can actually be a handy thing to do. So this season, we don't have any very short ones. Last season, I believe it was last season, we had one that was in a Federal Triangle, which 1 CP, 1 bounty, and two activities. And that one was actually easy enough to do in like 20 minutes. And that was actually a good way to farm some of the names if you are after those names, because you could also you are farming other stuff as well along the way that gave XP. Now, moving on to pools, which is the second section. Pools are, in fact, the system that the game actually uses. The simplification that we make, or that I make with sources, is just to get it down to those three, as those three are pulling from a ton of pools. And the thing to know, especially about pools, is that there are many of them. There are many, many, many of them. And that they are, in essence, you can also split them up into DZ pools, DZ/PvP pools, and LZ pools. And LZ is usually what we mean by missions, open world, everything that isn't the DZ in essence. We call those LZ just to differentiate them. And if we actually jump into the game to give a somewhat of a visualization of what pools are, as the best one is actually available to us from the summit, where we can, or countdown, where we can choose our targeted loot. So if we go into this targeted loot selection, these are all the separate targeted loots that are available to us. And alongside this is that, while of course with the summit and countdown, we only have access to LZ versions of this to be selectable, of course, but these all have basically another variant of them, which is their DZ variant, where DZ items, for instance, the gift backpack with Providence, or the Matador for Walker and Harris, and the Seska backpack that I'm blanking on the name now, that are all linked to only being DZ items. Those are all basically a separate pool that is only active when you're in the DZ, and when you're in the LZ, it's these pools that are available only in the LZ. What you can see normal pool as is basically all of these items, and that is, in essence, it's with the basically maybe 20 or 30 items missing, which is the raid exclusives, the crafting items, the crafting names that you cannot get in pools, or the hunter names, or the items that the loot goblin drops in Christmas, the Christmas goblin, the Christmas hoarder drops. With the exception of basically that and a few more items, everything is basically in that normal pool. And as you can imagine, if you are looking for an LMG, it is faster to go targeted LMG. And that's why that sourcing is important, to understand which sources are linked to being targeted, especially as, that is just, of course, just LMGs, instead of where the normal sourcing is coming from, and that is all of these pools. And the likelihood of even getting an LMG in several hours of play is tiny in comparison to if you go just to a zone or a mission that has LMGs as their targeted. We jump back to the guide. And yeah, this is basically what I explained in the guide. And what I explained here as well is this isn't an exhaustive list, as there are several more pools than I go into here. And that's why I simplified down to sources. Now, for the normal pool that is feeding into that normal source, as I said, it is basically two variants of it, one for the LZ, one for the DZ, but it's basically all of those pools, targeted pools, combined together into its own pool. And yeah, that makes it quite unfarmable. It is trying to get an item that you're specifically after from any normal source is going to be hard. And that's also going to include stuff where it's a specific source, where if you're trying to get a specific item, a specific named item from a named cache, you will likely get useful items still out of opening 20 named caches, but you might not get the one item that you are after. For instance, the Devil's Due, that was on the tip of my tongue minutes ago, but finally came to me with that Siska backpack. Now, the DZ ones, of course, are just the inverse one. And one thing also to note is that there are some items that are named that are only LZ only. That distinction also exists. It's only a few names, and yeah, usually LZ is so much easier to farm, so it's not an issue, but is a thing that at points people forget, and they, especially if they are just willing to farm the DZ in general, and they might not get an item for a while and they will ask themselves why. And those lists are also, of course, available with all of the both of the spreadsheets, the Reddit and the Discord spreadsheets list where they where items drop. Now, if we move on to targeted source, and targeted source is then pulling from, of course, that list of targeted pools like we have here. And only one targeted is always, of course, active at a time. If you are in a mission, the mission takes precedence over the zone. So even there, only one targeted is active at a time. And there are special scenarios where, for instance, doing the manhunt bounties currently inside of a mission, it actually is dropping you targeted from the zone, because it is technically not the mission that is active at that point. But there are some quirks like that, for instance. But yeah, in general, there's only, well, always, there's only one targeted active at a time, and it pulls from that. Now, each targeted, of course, is going to, each targeted pool will have only those items that are available in that at that time for it. So it is important to know when something is or isn't in that pool, for instance, for the DZ and LZ names. And those lists are just available to you with the Discord spreadsheet and the Reddit spreadsheet. And you just can look those up. And yes, so both the normal source and the targeted source can at points trigger to become an exotic, and those pull from your exotic pool. And we'll go into exotic pool in a second. The specific source is pulling from specific pools that have a chance of triggering. And notably, this is mostly those bosses ones. And some of the project items, for instance, that drop, those are actually technically coming from a specific source. And also things like key drops and tag assessments all are technically from a specific source, because they don't replace another of the sourcings. They're alongside of normal and targeted loot. And one thing that I will do in the future is actually do a separate video on specifically all of the optimization resources, as I feel there it might be good to go into them and give especially all of the places that they can drop, and then also give the easiest or best places to farm it. And there is also some tricks with it as well. So that will be likely a future video, but was beyond the scope of this video, I felt. And yeah, so the specific sources are just that list of the Reddit spreadsheet, as I'll open it up here again. And actually put it in frame here. That is that exotic drop locations and chances. And you just have to basically check this list for when you are after some of the exotics. And you can, especially knowing when something is available from this list and targeted can overlap it. For instance, if a chameleon is specifically a reward from bounties and can trigger from the final name of a bounty, and is a very common drop, as you can do a lot of bounties, but having bounties in a AR targeted zone means that you're basically double dipping. So you might get just from each of your targeted having a chance of being a chameleon as well. Although they could also be some of the, they could also be a capacitor if that is in your pool and such. But double dipping like that is actually quite valuable. And that's why knowing specific sources is handy, because if you are after something specific and the ability to double dip comes along, LMGs on Riker's missions, for instance, as well, for Bullet King or, well, Coyote, especially if the mask is on GTC, you can double dip that way. And yeah, there are many of those opportunities available to you. And when that is available, yeah, it is, if you're after those specific exotics, it can be really handy to know the specific sources for them. Now, if we go back, oh, also I should actually say, so in this same, in the Reddit one, if you actually go high-end gear, here on the right side is actually where it lists if it drops in the light zone or in the dark zone. So for the items that you're after, as I stated earlier, if you're after specific items that may be DZ only, you can come here and check which ones are DZ or LZ. And same is available in the Discord spreadsheet as well. Now, moving on, we actually, so as I list here as well, there are still many more pools. So for instance, when we talk about named caches are actually pulling from a pool that is all of the LZ and DZ named together in one pool, and legacy caches are pulling from all previous seasons track, reward track items all together in one pool. Current season is pulling from a pool that is all of the current season reward track items, and yeah, there are many more pools, and that is also why I prefer to talk in terms of sources, where it is actually what we really usually care about is mostly in terms of pools. Well, some of the quirks of some of the pools, and of course, where if some of the pools are. Some of the items that we're after are in the DZ or LZ pools, but usually we're more interested in sources, and we're mostly just interested in finding targeted sources, and if we can overlap targeted sources with specific sources. And that's why I basically collated down to those three sources to make it easier to discuss it in that way. And one other thing, and I will actually not explain that too well in this guide, as it is worth it to go into a video of its own on it, which is the exotic pool, as that is a little bit more complex than I wanted to put into this video, and it would take even more time to explain it well, and I feel that that would first elongate this video even further. And also, I want to get this video out, as I've been working on this guide and reiterating it for quite a few days. And I feel to really explain exotic pools well, I would need to actually make a few graphics and such. And I wanted to basically get this video out and then leave this to come back to at a later time. But in essence, what we can say about exotic pools is that, especially if you go to the Reddit spreadsheet again and go to the exotic drop location and chances, all of the ones that here in the other sources bracket here that are yellow, that means that they need something to be done, a prerequisite that is required for them to be in your character's exotic loot pool. And most of them basically require you to get a blueprint, which is for the Nemesis and Liberty and such. Once you have the blueprint, it starts dropping for you. And that is actually important to know that even, for instance, for the Nemesis, so with the Chatterbox and the Liberty, you basically get your first one from their quote-unquote quest. But with the Nemesis, actually, once you have the scope, which you will get from Tidal Basin, and you have one of the invaded stronghold pieces, and then get the blueprint from Grand Washington Hotel, if you're lucky enough to get that before you have the other items, you can actually start farming it. The prerequisite isn't actually getting a Nemesis. The prerequisite is specifically having the blueprint available to you. And I specifically say available to you because this also for past season items and such, even if you do not buy the blueprint and it's only available to you at iKia, then it actually already counts, which is a point of some confusion, as we usually say you need to have the blueprints, but that isn't technically the case. You need to have either have the blueprint or needs to be available to you from to buy from the blueprint vendor in iKia. Now, all of these yellow ones, then yeah, have some requirement tied to them, and especially, for instance, also the one that you should know about is that, yeah, for all of the current season items, they are intentionally in a way that you have to get your first one from the reward track, then you get the blueprint, and then they will start to drop for you. This leads into a quirk that we will come back into later, which is one of the current issues that exists. But yeah, if we go back, yeah, so basically you have to check that list, know some items are always in your, so yeah, the green ones especially are always in your, the ones that are green on the, underneath that other sources, those are basically always available to you in all of your sources. So here actually lists random NPC, exotic caches, and end of mission reward. Those are what I'm calling normal sources, and then targeted loot is targeted source, and well, some of these have raid bosses that would be a specific source. And yes, it is important to know which ones are and aren't available to you, because if it's not available to you, then trying to farm for it will lead to frustration, of course. Now, for instance, especially for capacitor, for instance, you need to do those 5 summit challenges. If you haven't done them, it will just not drop for you from targeted loot ARs. And yeah, that exists for some of the other ones as well. And when it states here blueprint, it can be either the crafting blueprint or the blueprint for reconfiguration. Both blueprints will trigger it to be added to your pool. That is also important information to know. And yeah, you basically have to collate with that list, and you can also gain it from experience, what drops where, but especially starting out, yeah, that list is invaluable to use. Now, moving on to some of the conclusions that that we can pull from this, and these are basically common knowledges that we have at this point, and that is, yeah, normal source is a huge pool. If you can go targeted, go targeted. It'll hugely increase your chances of getting your items. You will always want to go targeted over normal source. You will at times, of course, get normal source items that are useful to you, especially, for instance, proficiency caches are basically normal source. They're pulling from the full pool, and once in a while you will get an item that is useful to you, but it cannot be relied upon. If you really want to get a set together, just go targeted. The second one is relating to if you have the choice between a specific source and a targeted source, the consensus, which I agree with as well, is that, yeah, you should in all of the cases that currently still exist, you should go targeted over specific. But this is, of course, also somewhat dependent on the specific comparison. So if we had 12 masks in like 2 years, we have 12 exotic masks that are available in the mask pool. Then it would be better to go farm Coyote in Jefferson Trade Center for Coyote specifically. But that is currently not the case. We have 3 masks and paper napkin calculations, and especially, so we don't have good calculations for drop, how normal drops basically happen. We have good numbers for targeted loot and such, and somewhat for exotics, but not so much for just normal drops happening, how that system actually works within the game, also with its pity system that it seems to have. So it's hard to directly compare them, but also from experience and just players, the feelings of players that have played it for way too long, which of course, feelings are a bad source, but in concurrence with experience, they can be valuable sources if it's the only source that we have. And we kind of, the consensus is go farm targeted loot in places where a lot of drops happen. So of course, this isn't true if you just go and do open world farming or something, which is quite slow. If you even go CP farming, that's faster. If you go countdown, that's a lot faster. Together with floor 90 farming, gear farming from floor 90, that is likely the fastest one. And that means that go targeted over normal and go targeted over specific. But if you compare targeted and specific together, and if you can double dip that way, that is actually those are the juicy moments where you can go farm a specific exotic if you are after it. The times that happens is rare. That masks, for instance, in San Jefferson Trade Center, especially for instance for Coyote, as that is a popular one. But once in a while it does happen, and then if you are after it, those are very much the moments to go after it. Another examples are, for instance, LMGs on Riker missions for Bullet King and such, trying to think of other useful ones, but most of the other exotics aren't useful. Neither are those two really, but they're getting the collection together is sometimes also worthwhile. And this final one is if you are farming for specific items, so for specific gear slots or names from brands, what you really want to do, if I jump over into the game, is to go the brand over the slot. So if you're going for the sacrifice chest, you want to go Providence, and you don't want to go the body armor chest. And this is this is basically expanding on what we know of the pools, is that the Providence pool is a lot smaller than the chest pool. And whenever you want an item, you're much better a named item, or just you want a Seska chest or Seska backpack or a Fenris glove or something like that, always go the brands that are available to you over going the slot. And for weapons, of course, you don't have a choice. You don't get to. There is no FN brand to go, or SIG brand to differentiate with that. So you're locked to the weapon types. But what these gear slots are really handy for, so the body armor, knee pads, backpack, holster and stuff, is they do contain the exotics. So the exotics, of course, do not technically have a brand that is part of this list. And as such, they are only in the gear slot targeted pools. So when you're after a memento, you go backpack targeted. If you're a ninja bike, you go knee pads and stuff like that. Even for the items that technically do have a brand, for instance, some of the items are quite linked to a brand, but they are not in any brand slots. And the same for weapons. If you're going after a specific weapon, let's go exotic as well. Go farm with that targeted loot. So that is why, why the gear slot ones exist, as a lot of people do not understand why they would even exist. Because we usually always farm with brands in mind. But yeah, those are mostly just there for the exotics. And also when you're just after weaves and alloys in that way. If we then jump back, there are some quirks to the system, as I outlined in this final section, and that is that all of these pools seem to be generated by someone. They aren't auto-generated, they aren't auto-filled in, and we know that because, or we assume that because there have been typos in there that could not have come from copy-paste or auto-generation, that were basically human error, and that means that a human is basically putting the pools together, as we've had typos and such in the targeted pool list, for instance, and I list a few of them actually here. So in previous seasons, we had the closer and the setup that were mistyped in the target pools of Usina, so you could not target farm for them. And that is why also understanding the system is handy to know, because when bugs like this enter the fray, then once somebody explains that, you cannot target farm for them, you understand what they mean, basically. And then you can make the decision if you want to go normal source farming for them, just at full random, without any mode of targeting. And that made those quite hard to get until they fixed the bug. Now, currently, there is actually a similar one, which is that previous season items are usually added into the pool, into basically the general pool. So actually, if we jump over to that Reddit sheet and go to the bottom, in this final part, this is actually in the order of recent seasons. And specifically, these three, the Dread Edict, the Blue Screen, and the Catharsis, are actually currently faulty, as if you normally what would happen with previous season items, which has happened correctly with the Bloody Knuckles and Dr. Home from season 10, but those other three were from season 9, is that they go into basically the general pool, as we usually call it, which is basically that they go into the normal pools, and they go into the targeted pools as well. So you can, once the season is over, once we are now in season 11, you can actually, the season 10 ones, the Bloody Knuckles and Dr. Some, you can actually get them from targeted loot, and also just from exotic caches and such. But for instance, the Dread Edict, the Blue Screen, and Catharsis have actually been added to the normal pool, but they are incorrectly added to the targeted pool. And what they are there is that they still require the blueprint to go into the targeted pool. And seeing as they aren't in the reward track for the season. So this is usually how it would work in the season itself, is that you would need to get the first one from the season again. But here, of course, they aren't available in the season. And that means that unless you got the blueprint in the seasons, in season 9, then you have to normal source farm it, as they also have no specific sources. So yeah, that is quite annoying. But understanding pools lets you understand that quickly. So when someone says that there's an error in it and it's in the targeted pool for those items and it requires the blueprint, then you understand that, so for instance, for me that has the blueprints from season 9, as I played then, I can go target farm them, but somebody new that didn't play back then, or just skipped that season and didn't get the blueprints back then, they cannot actually target farm for it. And as I've said, when you can target farm for something, that's going to increase your chances by a lot. Now, the ways around this is to either open up a ton of exotic caches, for instance, those that are pulling from normal source, and hopefully get lucky, or just get them at full random, which sometimes for some people will happen. The other way, of course, to fix it is that we can share items across if we were in a group together when we got them. And that is actually the better way, is to find someone, if you are in a clan, if you have buddies that you can rely on that have access to it, to target farm with them. And once they get one, they can share it to you. Once it has been shared to you, it will actually, the blueprint will become available at iKia, and from that point it is actually in your targeted pool because you have the blueprint. What you can also do is what I've actually been doing for a few buddies that have come back into the game is, at the start of the reset, I will actually group up with them, and I will we will all open up our caches, and if either any of us gets the item that they are missing the blueprints for. So, for instance, I think we're still only missing for that group the blue screen one. And if we got one, we would basically share it across all of the people. So for me, I wouldn't need it, but the three of them would. So if I got it or they got it, so you can still get it from exotic caches. It is an in-target loot till you have the blueprint. We would share it across and we would solve it that way. So once it has been in your inventory once, you have basically from that point, that character has access to the blueprint. And if you account share blueprint, then all of the characters have access to it. And one other quirk that currently exists is that, and this is also why we kind of know that, or kind of can with high certainty assume, or know, that they are entered in by hand or some human interferences in there, is that busy little b is actually currently linked to the Liberty blueprint instead of its own blueprint, and for targeted loot. So yeah, that is a very weird quirk to have snuck in there. But hopefully these will get fixed, and in the past they have been. And then you can also, kind of see just normal pools and just being together of all the targeted pools. But this is still why we differentiate between targeted pools and normal pools, as quirks like this exist where something breaks, and then it is handy to actually know the system at full instead of the condensed system. Now, I have rambled on for quite a while on this subject, and hopefully I have imparted quite a lot of information to you. And to lead into the conclusion of this video, I hope you learned at least something from my ramblings, even if they were at points incoherent, as I have a habit of going into. We will come back to especially some of the specific drops. So, for instance, the keys and the optimization resources in a future video. And also, I want to revisit exotic pool at some point, as I feel if I make a good graphic for that, it would help explain that quite a lot, and that could just be handy as well to know for the community. And as always, I will link to this guide as well, and I will link as well to the resources that I've used here, that Reddit post, the Reddit spreadsheet as well. And I hope that you found it interesting and have learned something from here. Now, for my next video, I will likely do a video on just to have something simple on the classic red, the one that I'm using at the top of my calculations, that glass red, as just to show it as it is still a valuable build to have as part of any collection. It is the mule that pulls the cart along, while some of the other ones are full-bred horses like Striker. There is still some value to just that stubborn mule that can do anything and doesn't give up and has the endurance that no other one can match. So yes, I'll be doing a build showcase on a red build, and I have one specific one in mind, which is the one that I use in my calculation comparisons quite often. And after that, I will actually do another in-depth guide on another subject that I've tackled in the past, as there's quite a lot of story time attached to it, which is in-game time, as it is actually, that one is a very easy system to understand once you have been shown it in a visual form, I feel. But I feel there is some story time attached to it, and I can go a little bit in depth into that. So yes, I hope you enjoyed this one, and I hope you join me in the future for those videos. Have a good night.